Hello, everybody. My name is John Green. I'm the interim director of the Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 8th and final panel of the 2021 State of the Parties Conference. The name of the panel is Party Activities, and it's scheduled to occur between 4 and 5:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We have 4 very informative presentations today on this panel, which we will turn to shortly. Each of the presenters will talk for approximately 15 minutes. After that, we will have a Q&A when all 4 of the presentations are completed. The audience may submit questions during or after the presentations, and I will read those questions to the panelists and get their responses. I need to point out that on this panel and on other panels at the State of the Parties Conference, many of the papers have multiple authors, but for logistical reasons, we ask one of the authors to present the findings on screen. The bios of the panelists and copies of their papers are available on the conference website. So now let's go to our presentations. Our first presentation is by Jacqueline Kettler of Boise State University, and the title of the presentation is State Party Organizations, Independent Expenditures, and Spending Strategies. Professor Kettler, please proceed.
Great, thank you. I'm going to try to share my slides here. All right, are we good? Can you all see the screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. All right. Well, I'm here on behalf of a large team of co-authors. We've been studying independent expenditures for a while now, and we're really turning our attention to state parties and their spending in elections. So this is kind of the first step of what we envision being a broader project. And so we're excited to present for you all and to get some feedback on this project. We're connecting to what's now a pretty robust area of research on extended party networks, this view of parties as a coalition of actors working together to achieve related goals, which of course includes those formal party organizations, but also some non-party actors that ally with them, including different types of interest groups and other sorts of actors. We're really interested in kind of looking at a particular layer of these groups. And we know that, from previous research, there's some arguments that the formal party organizations and party leaders are guiding some of the actions of other actors in the extended party network. And we're really interested in focusing in on this a little bit and other groups that might be particularly very closely connected to those party committees. And so we want to evaluate we study the spending activities in state elections of 3 types of groups in the extended party network, starting with those state and local party committees like the Idaho Republican Party, but then also thinking about and adding in party affiliated groups. And these are non-party organizations, but they're really comprised of elected officials or their surrogates. So thinking about the Democratic or the Republican Governors Association. So their spending is really in an effort to help elect the party's candidates. And so we think that the closely aligned goal should affect, their spending strategies. And then some of these groups may also be groups created by some of these organizations. So for example, Good Jobs Colorado is largely funded by the Democratic Governors Association. So we consider those types of groups party committee or party affiliated groups as well. And then our third group are partisan coalition groups. And these in some ways reflect the extended party network in some ways, in that they are really a coalition of organizations that are funding an organization or a committee to support Democratic or Republican parties and their candidates. And so the support is coming from pre-existing and independent organizations, but they're working together to spend in a way to benefit the party. For example, Building Arizona's Future Chapter, which is funded by the DLCC, unions, and other liberal groups. So we think that this layer, these three types of groups operating in the extended party network, are likely to be close, their goals are closely related, and that should be affecting their spending in some ways where they may be working to, help benefit the larger party. And we also think it's important to think about the role of campaign finance regulations in evaluating party spending. And we know from previous research that party organizations often adapt to campaign finance regulations. And Citizens United and connected decisions like Speech Now are important for thinking about independent expenditures, since really it was just party committees that could be making, really investing in these independent expenditures before these decisions. But after those decisions, these other allied non-party groups are really, they're really able to expand their spending in this way. There's some evidence that in national elections, party organizations are helping direct or coordinate IEs, perhaps, whether, and so there is there seems to be some strategy perhaps happening there in relation to each other. So we're interested in seeing how party affiliated and partisan coalition groups, how their spending reflects or connects or diverges from party committees. But we also think it's important to take into account two broad contextual factors that are also going to shape the spending of these three types of groups. Of course, the campaign finance landscape, which I just mentioned, Citizens United decision and connected ones, that should be important for thinking about these non-party groups within the extended party network should be expanding their spending and through independent expenditures after this decision, whereas maybe that allows the party committees themselves to redirect their spending in other ways. While we also think it's really important to consider state level contribution limits, because limits on donations to parties or candidates, we may see some shifting in how these other actors kind of pick up the slack through independent expenditures. And then we also know that competition matters and that groups are going to be spending more in in competitive races or when there's when there's higher competition. And so we expect that competition is also going to be influencing the spending of these groups. We've been collecting independent expenditure data in state elections for quite some time now. We started working with the National Institute on Money and Politics to collect this data. They, of course, are merging with Open Secrets, but this is where our data comes from. And we wanted to be sure to have some consistent data across elections. So we limited it to states where we have good quality IE disclosure for more than just one election. So we didn't want just one state and one election in the data. So what we have is from the 2006 through 2016 election, we have 15 states. And then we have an additional 11 states that have consistent data from the 2012 through 2016 elections. NIMP they have a sector coding of groups, but we supplemented this coding by adding in particularly our categories of interest for this project, the party affiliated and the partisan coalition groups. But we also worked to refine the existing coding because we in particular spent time diving into the funding sources of these groups to really try to identify where the money's coming from. There are, that sometimes that's really challenging, but for most groups, we were able to identify the sector of coding through various resources. So at this point, our project is still largely descriptive. We've done some multivariate analysis to help, ensure and kind of double check the descriptive findings, but we think the descriptive findings are really interesting and informative for this stage of the project. And so we can start just by looking at independent spending over time for these three types of groups. And it's really interesting. The party organizations themselves, their independent expenditures have really been stagnant since the 2010 election. And so clearly this doesn't seem to be a major strategy for them, spending strategy, whereas party affiliated and partisan coalition groups have increased their spending over time dedicated to independent expenditures. So some clear separation and strategies after the 2010 election. we can dive into this a little deeper by looking at the percentage of funding dedicated to independent expenditures. And this just really helps illustrate that party committees over time, they're dedicating less of their spending, proportion of their spending to independent expenditures. Meanwhile, partisan coalition and party affiliated groups are really, this is their major strategy. Their spending is really dedicated in large part to independent expenditures. And so, as the campaign finance landscape has evolved, we see this kind of separation in strategies. We think, we argue that state contribution limits are also important to consider when evaluating the spending. And so we look at a couple things. This is looking at limits on contributions to candidates. And so, and graphing the average year independent expenditure total for these types of sectors. And we can see party organizations, their spending is not really largely affected by this contribution limits, but partisan coalition and party affiliated groups really seem to be largely spending in these states where there are those limits on contributions to candidates. So perhaps making up for some of those limitations by engaging in those independent expenditures. And then when we look at limits on contributions to parties, we see party organizations, of course, being more limited in their spending when there are limits on donations to parties. So perhaps their funding is constrained in those states. But we see party affiliated groups in particular spending a lot more on independent expenditures in those states. And so that may be a reactive element to helping make up where the party is more limited. Partisan coalitions may be a little bit as well, but not quite as, perhaps more independent from the parties and their spending behavior. We think that competition is really important to consider as well, and we look at this in a few different ways. We break it into legislative and gubernatorial elections because that's going to help us understand these strategies a little bit better, because there is some variation. And this is looking at legislative competition. On the left is percentage of state legislative seats that are competitive, and then on the right it's looking at chamber competitiveness. And we can see party organizations and partisan coalition groups really responsive. They're spending in those competitive places, whereas party affiliated groups are a little less responsive to legislative competition. And that's because they're really responding to gubernatorial competition. The party affiliated groups are spending so much of their spending in the independent expenditures in these competitive gubernatorial contests. And a lot this is due to the DGA and RGA being really active groups within within this sector. But it is interesting that party organizations actually spend a little bit more in uncompetitive races. So again, perhaps the parties are focusing on other races while party affiliated are really filling this role for spending in these gubernatorial contests. And then for a summary of findings, just significant growth of these non-party IEs and the extended party network since Citizens United. And we're seeing some interesting divergences in spending and contributing strategies. And so we think that that's really interesting, and especially how they may be reactive to the types of groups reactive to each other in the party committees, something we want to continue to dive into deeper. But we also are finding, right, that the campaign finance environment and partisan competition is really important we have to take that into account when trying to evaluate the connections and the strategies of these groups and how they may be taking cues from one another. So for the next steps, we're currently working on coding data for 2018. We'd really hope to have it available by this conference, but it is in process. So we hope to be adding that soon, and potentially 2020 data depending on availability. There's still work. We're still working on some multivariate analysis to to more deeply evaluate these trends that I just showed you. We're working on trying to figure out the best sort of measurements for some of these, particularly like dependent variable measurements. But we also want to dive in deeper to the contribution data. This is really focused largely on independent expenditures, but we also want to see, who are groups donating to parties or candidates, and how do other extended party network groups fit into these spending strategies. And then more broadly, also looking at some other types of groups that are involved in state elections and comparing spending strategies more broadly in that way as well. So we're still interested in digging into, but we are excited for some feedback as we continue on this project. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Professor Cutler, for that informative presentation. And now we'll turn to our second panelist, who is Ken Miller from the University of Las Vegas at Nevada. And his presentation is entitled Nationalized Spending in the 2018 and 2020 House and Senate Campaigns. Professor Miller, please proceed.
Great, thank you. Okay, do we have the opening slide? We see everything? Great. Okay. Well, in this project, what I'm looking at is a couple of intertwined trends that seem to have accelerated in the past couple of election cycles. Looks like I'm going to have to forward by hand here. There we go. All right. And the first trend, and the most obvious one, is the level of spending. So we were very concerned about the increase in spending in the wake of Citizens United and Speech Now decision in 2010, but really it's the past two cycles where we've seen the dramatic increases in spending. What you're looking at here is simply coming from Center for Responsive Politics, and this is in inflation-adjusted dollars. We see that in 2018, the increase compared to the previous midterm election was 45% greater spending. And then in 2020, we nearly doubled the amount of total expenditures in congressional races compared to 2016. And concurrent with this ramp up of expenditures, we're seeing the money go to sometimes odd places. The most obvious example of this would be in Kentucky in 2020. So Amy McGrath is a candidate who had previously run once for the House in 2018. She was unsuccessful. And then she runs again in 2020, challenging the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, in Kentucky. She is running a race that was considered by campaign professionals to be a real uphill battle and was not considered a viable candidate, but not a competitive one. And she brought in $96 million in donations to her campaign. From this, we're getting statements such as these. This is from Senator Brian Schatz, who's a Democrat from Hawaii, and he says, give here. Don't pick your favorite candidate or the one you've heard of, give here. This money goes directly to the most competitive races, not the most famous candidates. So this raises a few questions for me. The first is, to what degree are national resources coming to dominate competitive congressional races? We know from previous work that many House and Senate candidates, incumbents in particular, they're getting about 2/3 to 3/4 of their individual donations from outside of their district. So their financing is already nationalized. When we lump on top of that all of the independent expenditure activity, which is coming from national groups, we're looking at races that are financed almost entirely by national resources. And then second, are independent expenditures distributed in a way to account for the distorting influence that we're seeing from some national ideological donors? Frankly, we're seeing some candidates who are overfunded, for lack of a better term. Do independent expenditure groups account for this? Do parties account for this? And then third, do parties and non-party groups allocate their resources differently? We have some classic expectations about the efficiency of the distribution of money coming from parties, that it should be heavily biased towards the most competitive races. Are parties better at doing this than non-party groups are? So to address these questions, I'm grabbing FEC candidate expenditure summary files in 2018 and 2020, and then also independent expenditure summary files in 2018 and 2020. outside variables that I need here principally are related to competitiveness. And here I'm measuring competitiveness not with final election returns, but using the perceptions of political professionals at the time. So Rothenberg and Gonzalez, an alternative would have been Cook Political Report, are providing race ratings periodically for these races. And I'm using October 1st of the election year to capture what was the perception at the time that the expenditures were being made of what were the most competitive contests. And the categories of expenditures, I'm putting these into four. First, we have the candidates themselves, and they comprise about 65% of the total expenditures in these data. And this is simply the principal candidate campaign committees themselves. In terms of outside expenditures, 7% of this is coming from the formal party groups, that is the Hill committees, DCCC, DSCC, NRCC, NRSC. But a larger category now are these informal party groups. What these are super PACs who are ostensibly independent organizations, but I think we all know that these are party organizations. They're controlled by party leadership. For the Republican side, that's Senate Leadership Fund, Congressional Leadership Fund. On the Democratic side, we have those parallel organizations of Senate Majority PAC and House Majority PAC. For these data, I've included Priorities USA Action on the Democratic side. That's because this is a group that normally is participating only in the presidential race, but in 2020, they actually spent some money in a couple of Senate contests. And then finally, I've lumped all the rest of these independent groups together. And most schemes of categorization wouldn't do that, but in this case, I'm doing this because I'm really only interested in that difference in efficiency. So this is capturing all other super PACs, 501c dark money groups, as well as those single candidate super PACs that emerge in some of these races. And these overall percentages, of course, don't really tell us the whole story. The real tale here is how this money is distributed across competitive contests. And in the House, we're seeing what we would normally expect, that candidates are spending more as the race is perceived to be getting closer, but they're constrained in their ability to respond to competitiveness, that they're capped by contribution limits and they're capped by the realistic number of donors they could be appealing to. Yes, they're all appealing to a national donor class, but these candidates have a constrained ability to bring in money into their individual races. Whereas for independent expenditure groups, they're of course completely fluid. And so they're moving across and they should be responding more efficiently to how close the race is. The net effect of this is that candidates lose control of their contest as it gets closer. The percentages at the top of each of these bars are showing the percentage of expenditures that were controlled by candidates in each category of competitiveness. So for toss-up races, 44% of the expenditures that were made in those races were made by candidates. The rest were made by outside groups of one variety or another. In the next category, we're still not quite at the halfway point. And it's only when we get to this category termed here competitive, where we get 61% of expenditures were controlled by candidates. Although competitive races as a category were generally decided by about 10 percentage points. Over in the Senate, it's a little bit of a different story. We see the same phenomenon where outside groups are being efficient and they're more effectively allocating their resources towards those closest races. However, we get a little bit of lumpiness here. So the toss-up category, candidate spending was actually lower than in the next category of competitiveness, what I call here tilting. And then it's pretty much flat from the next two categories of competitive and less competitive. So the percentages are about the same, where we have $4 and $9 are being spent by candidates in toss-up Senate races. It's about 57% in the tilting races and so on. But what's going on in the Senate? And basically the story is there were some high-profile Democratic challengers. That Kelly versus McSally, Gideon versus Collins, Harrison versus Graham, these races in particular were bringing in enormous amounts of money from individual donors coming to these races. So the expectation here, or the finding really, is that angry money is less rational money, that there is a meaningful proportion, in this case was Democratic donor class, that appeared to be motivated more by dislike of key incumbents than by pragmatic concerns for majorities. That if they were being purely pragmatic, they really would have been allocating more of their money to Iowa and to Montana than they would have to South Carolina, Arizona, Maine, and especially Kentucky. And further, that ideological donors are uncoordinated. That is, they're inefficient. That the perfect strategy for any individual donor is to donate to the candidate that they want to win, or to donate to the opponent of the candidate who they want to lose. But if they're not coordinating amongst themselves, you get effectively too much money is going into a few of these races. So the question is, are independent expenditure groups diverting funds away from these candidates that have ample resources already? Do independent expenditure groups engage in compensatory behavior to compensate for the inefficiencies of these individual donors? So the way that I take a look at this is with some Poisson models that are estimating outside spending in the campaign as a function of candidate receipts, to see if candidate receipts are inversely associated with outside spending, especially in the Senate, where we expect that we have these high profile races, much more so than in the House. And then of course I need to control for competitiveness, control for how much the opposing side was spending in the campaign, and then controls for party, incumbent, and year. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of the coefficients here. I'll instead show the marginal expectations here for a couple of the key variables. The first, of course, is competitiveness. And it's what we would expect, that even after we control for these other things, that basic expectation of competitiveness is what is guiding spending decisions. In both the House and in the Senate, it's a roughly linear association between, as the race is expected to be more competitive, we get more spending. So the real story is on candidate receipts and outside spending. Over in Senate races in 2018 and 2020, as the candidate brings in an additional $10 million, that's associated with $1 million less in outside support, holding constant these other factors of competitiveness, party, year, and so on. Whereas over in the House, where we didn't see these nationally recognized races and these races getting national attention, we have a relationship that we would expect, which is that as a candidate spends $1 million more, we only get $31,000 more in outside spending associated with that increase in House candidate spending. So we're seeing here a compensatory situation where outside groups are moving money away from some candidates who simply don't need it. And then to move on to party versus non-party spending here. So are the parties distributing their resources more efficiently than non-party independent expenditure groups? And again, I'm using the same sort of design with Poisson models that are estimating outside spending as a function of candidate receipts, competitiveness, spending on the opposing side, party, incumbent, and year. The difference here is that I'm grouping formal and informal spending together on the expectation that these groups, although they cannot formally and officially be coordinating with one another, they're pursuing the same objectives of pure seat maximizing spending strategies that should be heavily biased towards the closest races, whereas non-party independent groups may have additional considerations at work here, that they may be more interested in furthering the career of policy champions, of perhaps some spending in an effort to gain greater access, so that they should be a little more weakly associated with the competitiveness of the contest. So I estimate these for the Senate side, and this gives you a sense of how these models worked, that we include independent spending when we're measuring party spending, and then we include party spending when we're measuring independent spending. That in theory, we could be seeing something where there's even a reciprocal relationship between outside groups trying to compensate for one another. We don't see that in these models in the Senate side. But what we do see is that party groups, both informal and formal party groups when taken together, are in fact more efficient. That you see this clear linear relationship upwards, that as the race is perceived as being closer, we get higher spending levels. Whereas on the independent group side, it's pretty well flat across the three highest categories of competitiveness. A little bit more formally, I have another set of models where I estimate these variables as single ordered categorical variables, and then I can test the equality of the coefficients between the models. That's the chi-square test there. And it shows that yes, that our eyeballs are not lying to us, that these slopes are different, that parties are responding more efficiently to the competitiveness of the race. Over in the House, I do the same thing, and we find the same thing, that formal and informal party groups are allocating resources more efficiently than non-party independent groups with respect to the competitiveness of the contest after we control for these other factors. So we see three things that are occurring in House and Senate races over these cycles. The first is that the more that the campaign matters, the less control the candidate has over the campaign. That as the race gets closer, less and less of that money is even coming from their district, which in and of itself is not a problem. They control those resources. However, as the race gets closer, more and more of the spending is independent spending, and it's not coordinated with them. And then second, that overfunding by national ideological individual donors, this influences independent spending behavior. That where national ideological donors are taking a great interest in a campaign, they're taking an interest in the McGrath race, or taking an interest in the Harrison race, that the independent expenditure groups are aware of this, and they appear to be moving their money around to avoid the races where the money is simply not needed. Where national ideological donors don't appear to be a major factor, which in this case were individual House races in 2018 and 20, independent expenditure groups are just allocating based on competitiveness, and they're just behaving as they normally would, as if the situation was not in existence. And then finally, parties allocate more strongly towards the closest contest compared with non-party groups. After we control for these various factors of party, we control for incumbency, we control for increased spending in 2020, we control for opposing side spending, we see that parties respond much more efficiently to the competitiveness of their race. All right, well, that is the findings from these last two elections. I want to take a moment at the end here to thank my research assistant, Reese Howard. She was invaluable in going through and deduping the FEC files, which can be such a hassle, as we all know. All right, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Miller. And now we'll turn to our third panelist, Dante Scala from the University of New Hampshire. And the title of his presentation is, Are Super PACs Super Efficient? Independent Expenditures in House Elections. Professor Scala, please proceed. Professor Miller, you probably need to take your content down.
Can everyone see my content okay?
There we are. Looks good.
Very good. Okay, thank you. Thanks, John, and thanks to the Institute for putting on this conference. It's good to be here again. So my paper is a very nice fit with the rest of the panel, with Jacqueline's work and Ken's work especially, and it looks at super PACs and their efficiency. You know, just a brief, look back. You're all familiar with this. We've now had a decade of super PAC involvement in federal elections, thanks to Citizens United and Speech Now cases. And of course, super PACs are free agents, as Ken pointed out. They can accept unlimited amounts of contributions. They can make unlimited amounts of expenditures. And provided, of course, that there's no coordination with candidates and political parties, and I put that question mark in parentheses there because obviously groups have found a lot of loopholes and potential loopholes to coordinate their activities with candidates and political parties. Everything from candidates storing B-roll film for groups to use, to simply looking at each other's spending patterns in terms of ad buys and so forth. So no coordination certainly seems to be a very porous thing for super PACs. So the question I started with is, what exactly have super PACs changed about the campaign environment? Now, obviously, being able to raise and spend lots of money in unlimited ways makes a difference. But what I was wondering about is, hypothetically, 10 years ago, we might have guessed that the invention of super PACs would lead to an undermining of political parties. For example, super PACs could have been vehicles for ideological groups seeking to change their parties. Instead, as Dwyer has pointed out, most super PACs don't do that, right? Most super PACs, there are some of those ideological groups, and most super PACs pursue electoral strategies that seek to change the partisan composition of government. And that's their first and foremost goal. Okay? And so what do? They make independent expenditures in favor of moderate candidates, not extreme ones that are more likely to win general elections, not less likely, all with an eye toward securing majority status or keeping majority status for their favored political party. So we can think about, and this is, echoes my colleagues' presentations, we can think about super PACs as party allies. If we think about Hernson's formulation, right, that parties are enduring multi-layered coalitions with mutual goals and interlocking relationships, that super PACs are in the midst of all of that. And that super PACs take on the role, as Hernson would say, of party allies. These are groups that take partisan actions, and in that sense, they're similar to the inner cores of political parties. However, they are all together less likely to coordinate their actions, right? They have that freedom of movement that Ken pointed out. But nonetheless, Dwyer, Kolodny, point out that they are nonetheless connected to the party core by extensive networks. And a lot of the work that's happening now, Dwyer and Kolodny have done, of kind of trying to sketch out exactly what these networks look like. And this is an effort to build on all that work. Hill committees, obvious emphasis on efficiency. There's a scholarly consensus that both the DCCC and the NRCC have become more efficient over time, right? Once upon a time, they threw lots of money at strong incumbents who were anxious to get even more money. They're much less likely to do so now. Jacobson gave the classic definition that efficient Hill committees are seat maximizers, right? Trying to maximize the number of seats for their party. Glasgow, whose work I use and kind of model my work after, defined efficiency as the percentage of committee contributions that contribute to marginal, i.e. competitive races. Inefficient spending, right, is spending money on a secure incumbent who would win anyway. Inefficiency is spending money on a weak challenger, not a strong one. However, Glasgow put a twist on his reading of efficiency, which has stuck with me for a long time. And Glasgow raises this question: are Hill committees, in fact, too efficient? In other words, do Hill committees focus too much on the most competitive races, and as a result, make them less likely to invest in potentially competitive seats? Okay, as Ken pointed out, right, we all know in advance, including people who run Hill committees and super PACs, what the experts think are the most competitive seats. But what about potentially competitive seats? So in other words, which definition of efficiency is correct? Is efficiency behavior that is seat maximizing, or is efficiency behavior that is majority securing? So in other words, if you run a Hill committee, maybe there's significant risk in going with a seat maximizing strategy, especially if as a result, you wind up with failure in securing a majority, even if it's, say, just 218 House seats. So that was the insight from Glasgow, which I'm trying to pick up on here. So Glasgow lays out 3 different measures of competitiveness, and unlike Ken, I decided to go with the end result. And in other words, my measures of competitiveness were the Democratic share of the two-party vote between 40 and 60%. That was the broadest measure of competitiveness. The intermediate measure was Democratic share of the vote between 45 and 55%. And then last but not least, the 25 most competitive races. And so the question I was interested in was, how were the resources of independent expenditure groups which include super PACs, but they're not exclusively super PACs. And the Hill committees allocated among these House races of these 3 levels of competitiveness. And so my research questions were, are these groups that participated in House contests, I guess focus on the House here, I didn't take on the Senate, are they as efficient as Hill committees? Second, does the spending efficiency of these groups vary with the size of these groups? And by size, I use one measurement, simply the amount of funds that they can throw at various races. Third, does the spending efficiency of groups vary by party, or more specifically, party alliance? What party these groups are allied with? So basically, I took essentially the top 40, like the super PACs, right? Those, and I was looking at the strategies of every group that made independent expenditures of at least $1 million in more than one House race. So I consciously left out those super PACs that only focus on one House candidate. And well, I'd be curious what you all think about that. But my thinking was a lot of times those super PACs are really just extensions of the candidate's campaign, and that it would be more interesting to look at super PACs and independent expenditure groups that were trying to make choices between contests rather than just focusing on one race exclusively. In any case, 40 groups on both sides of the aisle met these criteria. They totaled, it sounds like not many, 40 is not a large end, but they totaled, their spending totaled $677 million, which turns out to be 94% of all the independent expenditures made on House races, according to the FEC. And that included 21 Democratic groups, 16 Republican allied groups, and 3 nonpartisan. So this is a look at the Democratic allied groups, okay, all 21 of them, and it shows each group from top to bottom, from highest expenditures to lowest expenditures. And again, the lowest expenditures were making, just over $1 million in expenditures. And note how 2 groups dwarf all the rest of these groups. I mean, they're all spending $1 million or more, but the DCCC and House Majority are far and away the largest contributors of independent expenditures, right? The DCCC is making $144 million in spending on independent expenditures. House Majority spends more than $170 million, and together they are combined to make up 85% of the expenditures of these top 20 groups. Notice the third highest group, Women Vote, right, which is an extension of Emily's list. Women Vote spends a fair amount of money, $13 million, but obviously that's dwarfed by the rest of these groups, by those two groups in particular. And notice, here's a look at Republican, the top 15, 16 independent expenditure groups, all of which spent more than $1 million. We see the same pattern, right? Here it's the NRCC and congressional leadership, most of all. Again, congressional leadership and House Majority have been going at it for a good decade now. One is set to offset the other. These 2 groups dominate the rest of these independent expenditure groups. Club for Growth is, a bigger spender than Women Vote turned out to be. But again, you notice, you look back and forth at Democrats and Republicans, you see a very similar pattern. Now what I want to show you is the allocations that these groups made, again, according to those 3 levels of competitiveness. And I'll go through these pretty quickly because I'm running out of time. Again, this is the broadest measure of competitiveness. Okay, the percentage allocated to races where the Democrat got between 40 and 60% of the vote. As you notice here, we see not only do the 2 big groups, right, House Majority DCCC, not only are they focusing 100% of their expenditures on this set of races, but most other groups are as well, right? You see that large congregation in the upper left-hand corner of the graph. It's rare to see a group spending less money than, say, 60% of the vote. That dot in the lower left, by the way, is the National Rifle Association's Political Victory Fund. Republican allied groups, very similar pattern. Okay, we see that congregation not only by the big two, right, the NRCC and the congressional leadership, but most other Republican allied groups spend most of their money on competitive races broadly understood. Okay. Here we go to a slightly more stringent measure of competitiveness. Okay, where the Democrat got between 45 and 55% of the vote, and here again we see, in the upper right-hand corner, DCCC, House Majority, very efficient with their spending. But then when we go to the left-hand side, we see, now notice that the graph, the y-axis begins at 50, 60, and goes to 100. We notice more variation here than we did in the previous graph. Certainly we see that still that congregation of dots of groups in the top left-hand corner, but it's not quite as strong as it was in the broader measure of competitiveness. And here again, here are the Republican allied groups, similar pattern. We see congressional leadership, NRCC, very efficient spending, more than 90% of their money goes toward this set of races. We see that congregation of groups in the upper left-hand corner. These are smaller groups that are very efficient, but we do see a fair number that are less efficient, spending money outside of this kind of more stringent measure of set of competitiveness. Last but not least, here is the percentage allocated to the 25 most competitive races. Again, this is measured not by what we think will happen, but what actually does happen in terms of the final vote. We note that the DCCC, House Majority, almost half of their spending is on these two dozen seats alone. But then we go to the left side of the graph, we see a fair amount of variation in terms of the efficiency of their spending. We see now for the first time kind of more groups congregated in the lower left-hand corner, right, showing kind of less efficient spending as opposed to the upper left-hand corner. And on the Republican side, we see a similar, again, a kind of fairly similar graph, right? NRCC, congressional leadership, quite efficient, 40–45% of their spending goes to this small set of races alone. But then we see a fair amount of variation on the left-hand side among the smaller groups. Let me just wrap up with some conclusions. One thing that just leaped out at me was just the great consolidation of independent expenditure resources. Again, 10 years ago, we might have speculated that super PACs would undermine political party activity. What we see 10 years later, at least among the House, is that 4 groups dominate the independent expenditure landscape, and the 4 groups are Hill committees and 2 groups that are very closely aligned with each Hill committee. Are independent expenditure groups as efficient as Hill committees? I think we find some are, but certainly not all, especially as we got to more stringent measures of competitiveness. Does efficiency of these groups vary by party alliance? Not especially, right? Those graphs looked awfully similar in terms of the pattern of spending. Does efficiency of spending vary by size? Yes, right, somewhat. We see the big 4 in particular are very closely aligned with each other and seem to be following, like a tit-for-tat game theory strategy where they're all kind of congregating and focused on these very competitive races, whereas smaller groups are more likely to be inefficient. So again, in thinking in terms of efficiency, we think about House races, and again, that question of efficiency that Glasgow raised. Does efficiency mean seat maximizing, or does efficiency mean securing a majority? What I'd like to look at next is, in particular, kind of looking more at individual House races to see, whether, again, it's kind of Dwyer and Kolodny would say, are Hill committees acting to coordinate funding? And if they are they trying to coordinate on those most competitive races? And as a result, are Hill committees and super PACs in both alliances leaving seats on the table that could be competitive, but instead they're just plowing money into this version of trench warfare where they just spend money on the most competitive races? I also would like to look at what outlier groups might have in common, and I would welcome your suggestions for next steps as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Scala. Could you take down your slides, please? We're going to turn to our Professor Beck, please proceed.
Okay, are you seeing my PowerPoint?
Yes, we are.
Okay, very good, very good. Let me start by acknowledging the important contributions of my co-PIs on the 2020 election survey, Dick Gunther, Eric Nisbet, and Tom Wood. And I also want to express my appreciation to the Bliss Institute at the University of Akron for, again, putting together another valuable conference on the state of the parties. This paper turns our attention away from money to labor, to what the parties are doing with their money, maybe what the candidates are doing with their money. And it focuses on the ground game in the 2020 presidential elections. Campaigns typically invest their resources, capital and labor, in two ways. The so-called air war, which is where most of the money goes, I think, and the ground game. The ground game includes the personal face-to-face contacts by the campaign and its candidates with voters. Campaign attention to the ground game has a long, long history, harking back to the beginnings of electoral politics in the United States, before there really was a mass media, though there were newspapers during that time, almost all of them partisan papers. For the first 2 centuries, the ground game was the centerpiece of campaigns for local offices, especially in areas of the country dominated by political machines. Only through them did it make its way into presidential politics. Well, with the waning of local political machines, the ground game seems to have withered at the local level, although we really don't know that for sure, but it sure seems to be the case. By the 2000s, however, presidential campaigns in a hotly competitive race for the presidency began to focus their own attention on the ground game, especially with the Obama campaign in 2008. And they didn't leave it to the local parties. In some cases, they even bypassed and were competing with the local parties. The early ground game depended mostly on personal face-to-face contacts by local operatives. As technologies changed, however, phone contacts became more important. And we also see the case of the internet emerging, tweets emerging, email, social media, a whole variety of new technologies were sort of carrying the messages to individual voters in a personal sort of way. Presidential campaigns typically choreograph their ground games through field offices in battleground states, and in many cases nationally, through national telephone banks. All of these, though, were based on personal contacts, rather than the blanket messaging through the media even when it was micro-targeted to particular groups. In analyzing the ground game, then, it's important to take into account both the face-to-face contacts and these new technologies. And this paper is unique in focusing on both of them. Okay, let me talk about how we've measured the ground game in this paper. It's based on voter perceptions of direct contacts by the parties and their candidates at the presidential level. I think this is a better way to do it than the alternatives. We often measure the ground game by the presence of field offices. I don't think that is quite adequate for reasons that I'll get into later on. And then in the old days, when the local parties were performing these activities, there's some really classic studies going back to Harold Flip Gosnell in Chicago and others in the 1950s, where they actually surveyed party leaders, party precinct captains in many cases, to ask what they were doing in the campaigns. But they really didn't talk to voters, but they tried to connect these activities with how the vote went in that particular locale. What we do in this paper, or what I do in this paper, is use a project called the Comparative National Elections Project. And I'm using the US surveys. We have over 60 surveys in countries around the world, but I'm focusing only on the United States surveys. And there are 4 of them. One that was conducted in 2004, another one that was conducted in 2012, a third that was conducted in 2016, and then a 4th that was conducted in this past presidential election of 2020. What is unique about the CNEP questions is that not only do we ascertain total party contacts as reported by voters, but we separate them into personal contacts that are face-to-face and these other forms of contacts that new technologies have made possible over the phone, through Twitter, through directed emails and the like, feeling that these kinds of contacts also are important, and I think, in fact, increasingly important in modern presidential campaigns. And what we do there is unique. No other survey that I know of differentiates or separates these 2 different kinds of contact, and you'll see in a minute how that plays out. The paper will focus mainly on the 2020 studies, but in the understanding that what really allows us to make sense of an election is comparison with other contests, we will look at 2016, 2012, and 2004. Okay, let me begin with the overall party contacts. And this is the overall measure that combines both direct, personal, and these other forms of contact that are more technology driven. And here what I've done is show you the contacts as reported by voters from Democratic campaigns and candidates, from Republican campaigns and candidates, and then interestingly from both parties. And I want to talk about the both parties also in a few minutes. What you'll see there is that there was a greater effort in terms of contacts on the part of both parties in 2020 than there had been in 2016. But if you go back to 2012 and 2004, you have in 2004 a little bit more effort from both parties. In 2012, just about the same. What's interesting here is what you see on the left-hand side on the vertical axis. And that is that almost, well, really over 40% of people in most cases, most years, and close to that in 2020, are reporting that they were contacted by the parties. Do you believe that figure? I'm not sure that I do totally, but it is what we have, and unfortunately, I don't have any way to verify that. I wish I did. Democratic and Republican contacts are not significantly different in any year. And you see those by comparing the blue bar with the red bar and over here in 2020. And those differences really are not significant. There was in 2016 an expected edge that should have been held by the Democrats. The Trump campaign, as we will remember, didn't really do much in terms of the ground game. It focused its attention more on rallies and other kinds of expenditures, and that is at least what we thought. After the election, it appeared to be more important that there was some ground game activity engaged in by the Trump campaign, but it wasn't really visible. Whereas the Clinton campaign focused on field offices, focused on canvassing, focused on volunteers going door to door, talking to people on the phone, and so forth. And so one expected there to be a substantial difference in 2016 between the two campaigns. And the truth is, there was not. And I'm not particularly sure why that is the case, but indeed, at least in terms of the reports from voters, it is the case. And if we go to 2020, what we expected there was a diminution of effort in the ground game by the Biden campaign, mainly because of the pandemic. They didn't really establish many field offices. They didn't send their volunteers out to knock on doors and distribute literature face-to-face at various settings, various events. Whereas the Trump campaign I shouldn't say it that way. The Trump campaign moved away from what it seems to have done in 2016 to really embrace the ground game in 2020, and we're much more active there. The end result, not much different between the two parties. And that, I think, is important to bear in mind. One thing that's really unexpected here in these figures, in figure 1, is that a lot of respondents, around 20% of them, report that they had received contacts from both parties. Now, what we're told is that the parties in this modern era are really focusing their attention on mobilizing their base voters. And of course they do that, and we can see that in figure 1. But there also is a lot of attention paid to mobilizing people, or at least contacting them, on both sides. Maybe they can't measure the base very well, or maybe sometimes they're just focusing on voters that are easy pickings, low-hanging fruit that they can actually make contacts with. But the important thing here is that particularly in 2004 and 2012, less so since then, there were contacts that were made with or from both voters or both parties. And later I'll show this in a different way, but it's important to bear this in mind as we go forward. Let me now turn to a breakdown of personal versus other kinds of party contacts. And here again, the chart becomes busier. What you'll see in blue always are the Democratic contacts, either personal or in other ways. What you'll see in the red crosshatched bars are the Republican contacts, personal and in other ways. And what you'll see on the far right-hand side for each year is contacts that were received from both parties, either personal or other. It's important to distinguish between them because what you'll see is that the other kinds of contacts are far more prominent than the personal contacts. Personal contacts are hard. They take a lot of labor. They take a lot of exposure of people to individual voters. Any of you who have knocked on doors and had a door slammed in your face will recognize that indeed there is a price to be paid for the kind of personal contact that often has proved to be, both in political campaigns and fundraising, to be the most important way to mobilize contributors or voters in this case. But it's very hard to do. It's much easier to do via email, much easier to do via tweet, much easier to do in other ways, certainly by telephone as well. And so you kind of see that displayed in 2020, certainly, and in the earlier years as well. Personal contacts were higher in 2020 and in 2016 than they had been before. Other types of contacts were higher in the earlier years, and then they returned to this level in 2020, but they were at their lowest point in 2016. And you can see this, well, let me back up for just a minute. What I want to do now is take this in a different direction. And the different direction is that what we have learned over time is that the presidential campaigns have been very much inclined to focus their attention on only about a dozen states. And these are the battleground states. The rest are flyover states. Candidates don't go there. They may run ads there, particularly national ads there, or ads that overlap from neighboring battleground states. But the real campaign is focused on these states that are going to turn the tide in terms of the margins in the Electoral College. And so what I did was replicate what I showed you before, but I've now done it by battleground states versus non-battleground states. It's difficult, by the way, to get a good measure on the battlegrounds, partly because it changes over the course, or they change over the course of the campaign. Campaigns will decide to emphasize certain states early on, but find that they either think they're locked up and they don't need to spend more time there, or they really find that they may have an advantage in a particular state and will move money and campaign activity and ground game activity to that state. And so what I did instead was I defined the battleground states as those that had a margin of 6% or less between the major party candidates in the results of the election. And this dwindles down the number of battleground states, in some cases, to less than a dozen. But it still, I think, provides a pretty good measure of which ones are the most competitive or the most likely swing states. I, by the way, have done it using the battleground states as defined by the campaigns, at least in the years where I had that information. And the results really are not much different at all. Okay, so let's take a look at figure 3, which is contacts by party in the battlegrounds versus non-battlegrounds. And remember, these are overall contacts, both personal and other combined. And what you'll see there is very clear, is that the battleground states show higher levels of Democratic contact in 2004, but about the same levels in 2020. And what's interesting about this is that the battleground states no longer seem to be the locus of ground game activity, at least not differential or differentially from the non-battleground states. And I would call attention in particular to that right-hand set of bars where you'll see really no significant difference between the Democrats and the Republicans in terms of overall contacts in the battlegrounds. And you'll see little difference between the battleground contacts and the contacts in the non-battlegrounds, maybe with the exception of a slight difference in terms of Republican contacts in the non-battlegrounds being a little bit less than they were in the battlegrounds. Again, both parties are making contacts in the battlegrounds more than they are in the non-battlegrounds, and that pattern has remained. So there's a disappearance there of the focus on the battleground states. I'm not exactly sure why, and I invite you to begin to think about why that may be the case. Next, let me break this down into personal versus other types of contact. And on the personal side, what you'll find is that the Democrats and Republicans are higher in the battlegrounds in 2020 and in other years as well, especially 2016. And that's in figure 4 here. Other types of contact, which is figure 5, show the gaps that I've talked about before between the battlegrounds and the non-battlegrounds that disappeared for most parties, for both parties by 2020. And again, this diminished focus is something that I can't really explain. There may be reasons why the ground game activities now are, particularly for the other types, maybe as much directed towards raising money as they are towards getting the vote out. And it's very easy to send all kinds of messages to voters no matter where they live who are likely to be in that support base, and raise money for them from them to be able to use that money then in activities such as media advertising in the battlegrounds. But we of course don't have those kinds of data. But the important thing that I want to emphasize here is the lack of difference in 2020 when it comes to these other types of contacting. Now let me turn to who is contacted by the parties. And I show you this very busy table, which I hope you can read. I'll go through it a bit, but what I've done is taken about every political variable that I could think of that might be important, and every demographic variable that I think of that might be important, and taken a look at how it correlates with the overall contacts by the Democrats and the Republicans, and then the personal contacts by each party and the other types of ground game contacts by each party. To make it a little less busy, I've only shown you the significant correlations, but there are a lot of them. And there are a lot of them that go in fairly predictable directions. And let me just kind of highlight some of them. The parties obviously are expected to concentrate on mobilizing their support base. And to a considerable extent, that indeed is what they do. The base mobilization strategies predominate for both personal and other types of contacts. For the partisan variables, the political variables, party identifiers get contacts from their party. They also go to, or the parties go to people who have voted their way or reported that they have voted their way in past elections and participated in the party primaries. They also go disproportionately towards party activists. And so the parties are emphasizing, are contacting their supporters in these cases. Everything is expected here. That's what they should be doing. In terms of the demographics, the parties are, both of them, contacting older voters, contacting higher income voters, contacting social media users, contacting minorities, though more for the Hispanics, more Hispanics by the Democrats than in 2016, contacting white Christians for the Republicans in particular, contacting rural residents for the Republicans in particular. And of course, within each of these demographic groups, you can almost break them down by party. And I did that. I don't show it here, but they're contacting partisans within those groups. They're not operating inefficiently by contacting people on the other side. The political correlations are stronger, as one would expect them to be, than the demographic correlation, for the very reason that I just mentioned. And that is that within any of these demographic groups, there are going to be Democrats and Republicans, and the parties are going to contact the ones who are on their side or in their support group. And the other types of contacts, as one might expect, are far more common, far more related to these demographic and political characteristics than the personal correlations. Some people are targeted by both parties. If they have a high degree of interest, they're going to receive contacts from both parties. Again, assuming that the parties are contacting like-minded voters in those high interest groups. They are more likely to contact regular voters. They are more likely, interestingly, to contact union members in 2020. This is a change from 2016. I think the Trump campaign realized that union members were a part of their support base. And so they concentrated on contacting them in 2020 in a way that they may not have done back in 2016. And in fact, in terms of reports by ordinary voters, union members were much less likely to report contacts from the Republicans than they were to report contacts from the Democrats. Okay, we could go through that to a considerable degree. I don't intend to dwell down anymore, although you may have questions about particular things, and I'd be glad to field those questions. But let me now turn to some conclusions. Despite expectations both parties' ground games were active in 2020 at about the same levels that they had been in 2016, in 2012, and in 2004. More contacts were in 2016, especially for the non-personal types, but the difference really isn't very large. Personal contacts remain very rare, even if they are presumably less effective. They are obviously more difficult. The Democratic ground game in 2020 did not fall off as expected, just as the Republican ground game in 2016 achieved more than it was expected to in that particular contest. As expected, contacts are heavily targeted on mobilizing base supporters, at least as voters are reporting. The thing that I was emphasizing before is that Republicans now have concentrated on targeting union members, and I think with considerable success in terms of the vote results. Democrats contacted Hispanics more in 2020 than they had in 2016, where they very much underperformed in the contacts with Hispanics. But interestingly, they didn't yield as good a result with Hispanics as they had in 2016. They continued to underperform, the Democrats that is, in contacting young voters, who are a very difficult group to contact. They aren't very well concentrated in the pandemic. One of the places where they were concentrated, that is college campuses, were not really open to the kinds of contacts the Democrats had conducted back in their campaigns that they had conducted back in 2016. And so they may have fallen off in that sense. But the principal mystery that I want to leave you with is that party efforts seem to be no longer disproportionately concentrated on the battleground states. And again, I'm puzzled as to why there is this change. Maybe it's that the ground game now has transformed into a way to raise money as well as a way to mobilize voters and get their votes. And that would make some sense. And we saw the Trump campaign in particular raise tremendous amounts of money from the grassroots, as the Sanders campaign had in both the 2016 and the 2020 primaries. Well, let me close it out there. I welcome your questions. Again, I'm very grateful to the Bliss Institute for having this conference, for inviting me back again. I wish it could have been in person, which is a little less awkward than doing it through a virtual setting. And I have a lot of sympathy for my grandkids who were in school last year virtually and found it to be very taxing, which I do as well. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you very much, Professor Beck. Could you stop sharing your PowerPoint? That would be very helpful. Now we'll be turning to some questions from our audience. And one of our astute attendees noticed that the word nationalization appeared in all four of the presentations. That person has a question that I'd like you all to try to answer, even if it involves a little speculating. And then there's a second question that I'd like to turn to next, which is related. But the first question is, we had seen in 2020 and over the last couple of years an increase in political competitiveness across the country. We also see an increase in campaign spending, as you all have documented. And so the question is, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Is the spending causing greater competitiveness, or is greater competitiveness for other reasons causing spending? And why don't we begin with Kim Miller?
Sorry, I'm struggling to get my microphone unmuted.
Thank you.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. My computer was being very slow to unmute. So I heard a couple of things, first about nationalization and then competitiveness and money, and which one follows the other one. By and large, money follows competitiveness, and I say that purely because, look, most of the money is national. We should really think of the financial ecosystem for federal elections as a fully nationalized one, and that most of the money that's coming into these House and Senate races is not coming from these districts in the first place. So it's flowing into these races, and it flows in later. It's not that these races are being identified out of the blue and then getting this national money injected in them, becoming competitive. It's that they're identified as competitive, and then the national money is injected in there. And so I said the word nationalization again, and that